Did he admit to you that he murdered his family? He absolutely did. But that is not the only thing he admitted. Here is what I want you to sit with before we go any further. A man is serving 5 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. He is never walking out of that facility. He has nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to protect, no deal left on the table. And yet, from inside that cell, he picks up a pen and he starts writing. Not just about what he did, about who else he believes belongs in this conversation. That is where this story begins. Not in a courtroom, not in a guilty plea, in a prison cell, in letters that were never meant to become evidence, written by a man who had already lost everything. If you are new here, welcome to Midnight Evidence, where we go deeper than the headlines and let the documented record speak for itself. If this kind of investigation is what you are here for, take a second right now and subscribe so you never miss what we uncover next. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what those letters say, you first have to understand what this case was, and more importantly, what it was not. In August of 2018, Shanann Watts returned home from a business trip in the early hours of the morning. She was 34 years old. She was 15 weeks pregnant. She had 2 daughters. Bella was 4 years old. Celeste was 3. Shanann had spent approximately 5 weeks away from home, working as a sales representative for a multi-level marketing cosmetics company called Limelight by Alcone. She was active on social media. She documented her family openly and proudly. By every account from the people who knew her, she was energetic, devoted, and deeply in love with the life she had built. She arrived home at approximately 1:48 in the morning, on August 13th, driven by her friend and colleague, Nico Atkinson. She walked into her house, and by the time the sun came up that day, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn son she had already named Nico were gone. Chris Watts was arrested. He pleaded guilty. He received 5 life sentences plus additional decades connected to charges related to Shanann's pregnancy and the treatment of the remains. That part of the story is closed. The conviction is not in question here. It never has been. But here is the part that is not closed. Because here is the thing about a guilty plea. It means the prosecution had enough to stop. It does not automatically mean every question raised by the evidence was formally answered. Those are 2 different outcomes, and the difference between them is exactly what we are here to examine. Chris Watts worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, monitoring oil field equipment at well sites in Weld County, Colorado. Through that work, he met a woman named Nickel Kessinger. She held a Bachelor of Science in Geology from Colorado State University. She worked as a field engineer through a contractor called Tasman Geosciences, which operated directly for Anadarko Petroleum, the same company. She was not a casual outsider who happened to cross his path. She understood oil field operations from the inside. She knew the roles on that site. She knew the responsibilities attached to each of those roles. She knew what each position was supposed to do, and, more importantly, what it was not. Keep that detail in mind. We will return to it. According to what Kessinger told investigators across 6 separate recorded sessions, the relationship began in June of 2018. She said she met Chris at work. She said he told her he was separating from his wife. She said she genuinely believed she was not involved with a man in an active marriage. That was her account. She cooperated with law enforcement voluntarily. She was never charged with any crime. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke made a deliberate prosecutorial decision not to pursue charges against her. That is a documented fact, and this video is not going to pretend otherwise. But here is also a documented fact. In February of 2019, Chris Watts sat down with investigators for what became known as his full confession. And in that confession, he told a fundamentally different story about the relationship. He said Kessinger saw a photograph of Shanann on his phone's lock screen. He said she knew he was married. He said she knew he had children, and he stated directly that she lied when she told police she did not know. Those are his words, his confession, on the record. He also described what the relationship felt like from the inside. He said every time he was with her it was like there was a blinder in his face. He said he felt she pursued him, which was unusual in his experience. He said he felt more in control around her than he typically did. And then he said, the one thing that tells you exactly where his mind was. He called it a roller coaster ride he kept punching the ticket on and could not get off. That description matters more than it might initially appear, and we are going to come back to it. By every account from people who knew Chris Watts before 2018, he was passive, quietly, almost pathologically agreeable. His own family described him as someone who avoided conflict at all costs, someone who would rather withdraw into silence than push back on anything. Shanann herself, in messages recovered during the investigation, described frustration with how little he communicated. She wrote about feeling like she was having a conversation with a wall. Friends who spoke to investigators painted the same portrait. A man with no real spine of his own. A man who became whoever the dominant personality in the room needed him to be. And then Nickel Kessinger entered the picture. And suddenly, this same conflict-avoidant, passive man was contacting a realtor. He was planning to sell the family home that his wife and daughters were living in. He was discussing timelines, laying groundwork, operating with a kind of purposeful forward momentum that no one in his life had ever seen from him before. That is not the behavior of someone acting alone on a quiet internal impulse. That is the behavior of a man who believes a specific future is already waiting for him. A man who has been told, clearly and repeatedly, what that future looks like, and precisely what it is going to require from him. The question the official record never formally answered is straightforward. Who was doing the telling? In 2019, an author named Cheryl Cadle began a correspondence with Chris Watts in prison. He wrote back. They exchanged letters over an extended period, and he eventually placed her on his visitor list. He told Cadle something notable early in that process. He said he believed his spoken conversations were being recorded, so instead of talking, he put his confessions on paper. And what came out of those letters directly contradicted what he had told police. He had told investigators the murders were not planned. He described the events of August 13th as the result of an argument that escalated, a moment of uncontrolled rage, something that happened rather than something that was decided. But in his written letters to Cadle, he wrote this. On August 12th, when he finished putting the girls to bed, he walked away and said to himself that it was the last time he was going to be tucking his babies in. He wrote that he knew what was going to happen the day before and did nothing to stop it. Read that carefully. He knew the night before. He made no attempt to prevent it. That is not a spontaneous act. That is premeditation, described in his own handwriting. And the motive he wrote down alongside that admission is just as significant. He wrote that he knew if he took his hands off of Shanann, she would still keep him from Nickel Kessinger. That is the motive he wrote with his own hand, in a letter he believed carried less risk of monitoring than his spoken words. In the years that followed, the letters evolved. The tone shifted. He began writing about Kessinger in language that was striking in its intensity. He called her a harlot. He described her as a Jezebel who led him astray. He used biblical language drawn from the book of Proverbs, writing about seductive women who speak sweet words of destruction. He wrote that the words of a harlot had brought him low, that her flattering speech was like drops of honey that pierced his heart and soul. He wrote that little did he know, all her guests were in the chamber of death. Now the obvious response to all of that is simple. A convicted murderer is blaming someone else for what he did. People in prison do that constantly. That motive is real, and it cannot be dismissed. But the specific language he used, written privately over multiple years in letters he believed were less monitored than his conversations, is worth examining as something beyond a deflection. Because what that language describes is not a man who felt like an equal partner in a shared plan. It is the language of someone who felt directed, led toward something by a force he experienced as larger than himself, something he could not refuse or resist. He did not write like someone who set a trap. He wrote like someone who walked into one. In 2020, Chris Watts was housed at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. In the cell directly adjacent to his was a man named Dylan Tolman. For 7 months, these two men talked through thin prison walls every single day. About faith, about women, about what actually happened on the night of August 12th and the morning of August 13th, 2018. In 2025, Tolman published a book titled The Cell Next Door. The official published description of that book contains a line that has received remarkably little attention given what it claims. It states that in his writings, Chris reveals details of the murders and the events that led up to exactly what happened. And then 4 words appear that do not exist anywhere in any court document connected to this case. Chris admits he had an accomplice. That is not a theory. That is not online speculation. That is the published description of a book currently available for purchase, attributed to a man who spent 7 months in daily conversation with Chris Watts through a prison wall. Tolman also shared something else in subsequent interviews. He described a behavioral pattern he observed in Watts. He said, and this is a direct quotation, that Watts will talk to a girl and she becomes his everything really fast. He becomes obsessed with a woman and she becomes all he can think of. And he will do whatever they ask him to do. Whatever they ask him to do. Tolman is not a law enforcement officer. He is not a forensic investigator. His conversations through a prison wall are not sworn testimony, and his account has not been independently verified. That distinction matters, and this documentary is not going to blur it. But here is what is significant about what Tolman describes. It is consistent with every other source that touched this case. It matches what Watts himself wrote to Cheryl Cadle. It matches what Watts said in his February 2019 confession. It matches what Shanann's friends told investigators when they described a man who had no internal anchor of his own, a man who mirrored back whatever the most dominant personality around him projected onto him. That is not a legal defense. It is a description of a psychological pattern, and it is a pattern that becomes important when you consider what the official discovery record shows about the night before August 13th. Because on that night, Chris Watts and Nickel Kessinger were on the phone together for 111 minutes. That call is documented in the official record. It is time-stamped. It exists. And the question of what was said during those 111 minutes was never formally pursued by investigators. Not once. What Tolman says Watts told him through that wall about the content of that call, and what allegedly happened at the end of it, is where we are going next. Because what the official discovery file of this case contains, confirmed and time-stamped by law enforcement itself, has been sitting in the public record for nearly 8 years. And it deserves to be examined honestly, carefully, and completely. That is where we are going in Part 2. We are going to walk through the documented phone evidence, the cell tower data from the morning of August 13th, the searches her phone ran that directly contradict what she told investigators across 6 separate sessions, and the question that the district attorney himself confirmed on record and then acknowledged was never independently pursued. If you want to be here for that, subscribe to Midnight Evidence right now. Every case we cover goes this deep. Every fact we present is sourced. And if this video gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps more people find this investigation. Nickel Kessinger gave 6 recorded interviews to investigators. Across all of them, she maintained that she had no meaningful knowledge of what Chris Watts was doing, where he was going, or what his life at home actually looked like. That was her consistent account. And in her very first session with detectives, she described his decision to go to the oil field site on the morning of August 13th as routine, normal operations. Nothing that stood out to her. 6 days later, after investigators had obtained and reviewed her phone records, that account changed entirely. She suddenly recalled a detailed conversation from the night before August 13th, in which she had specifically questioned why Chris needed to go to Survey 319 first thing that Monday morning. Her documented words to investigators were that it was not his job, that he had no reason to check the release valve at that site, and that the task belonged to the environmental team rather than to an operator in his role. Now pause on that for a moment. That is not a question someone asks from casual familiarity with the oil industry. It requires knowing the specific function of different roles at a field site. It requires understanding the distinction between what an operator does and what the environmental team is responsible for. It requires knowing that a visit to that particular location for that particular reason would fall outside the normal scope of Chris Watts's position. A geology graduate working as a field engineer in that same contracting environment would understand every one of those distinctions clearly and precisely. She knew that visit was not routine, and she knew it before the investigation told her. Then came the evening of August 13th, hours after Chris had been at that location, after everything that had already taken place at that site earlier that morning. Kessinger sent him a text message. She asked him to send her a photograph, documenting proof that he had been at Survey 319 that day. Investigators reviewed months of communication between the two of them. Texts, calls, and exchanges going back across the full documented length of their relationship. In that entire record, there is not a single other instance of her asking Chris Watts to photograph his location on a workday. Not once across any prior morning. Not at any other site. Not after any other shift. Only August 13th. Only Survey 319. Only the day that location became the center of a murder investigation. The investigator who had that information directly in front of him did not ask why. He did not ask what had changed. He did not ask what prompted a request that had no precedent anywhere in months of prior communication. He moved on. Now let us talk about the phone deletions, because this is where the documented record becomes very difficult to set aside. On August 14th, the day before she made contact with anyone connected to the investigation, Kessinger cleared her entire phone. Every message, every photograph, every contact, every email, everything connecting her name to Chris Watts was removed from that device. She then told Chris to do the same on his end. She also contacted her close friend Charlotte, who had received photographs of Chris and detailed personal conversations about him, and instructed Charlotte to delete their entire thread as well. On August 15th at 5 in the morning, law enforcement received a call from Anadarko's security manager. He gave investigators two names, Chris Watts and Nickel Kessinger. Law enforcement had her name before she made a single move toward them. At 9:50 that same morning, nearly 3 hours later, Kessinger contacted investigators. And here is what her phone was doing during that same window, while she was presenting herself as someone cooperating with an active murder investigation. Her phone was running searches on how long phone companies retain text message records. What investigators can access from content that has already been removed. The legal distinction between the existence of a message and the content of that message. Then she deleted those searches too. Removing material during an active murder investigation is not a minor procedural detail. It was confirmed. It was documented in the discovery record. And the explanation she offered for clearing her phone was that she was disgusted by Chris Watts and did not want his name on her device anymore. That answer was accepted. The interview moved forward. Now let us talk about the phone calls on the night of August 13th, because this is the sequence that demands the most careful attention. Between 9:48 in the evening and 2:18 in the morning, phone records show Nickel Kessinger and Chris Watts connected across multiple calls. The total duration was 156 minutes, 2 hours and 36 minutes of conversation. On the night Shanann and her daughters had been publicly reported missing. On the night a statewide alert had been issued. On the night their photographs were circulating across the news. When Detective Kobach walked Kessinger through those calls, reading the timestamps out loud, noting the duration of each one, and asking her to account for what was discussed, she was unable to do it. She told him her memory of those conversations was unclear. Here is what makes that significant. In those same recorded sessions, her recall of earlier events was sharp, organized, and specific. She provided locations, dates, and details from conversations weeks prior, with clarity and precision. Her memory of July 2018 was detailed and coherent. Her memory of the single most consequential night in the entire investigation was, in her own words, unclear. She offered to come into the station and manually go through her remaining messages to fill in the gaps she could not account for verbally. That meeting was never arranged. She never returned. No investigator across any of her 6 sessions followed up on that offer. And then at 1:51 in the morning, Kessinger called Chris. At 1:58, while that call was still active, Chris began receiving incoming calls from the Frederick Police Department. They ended their call. Chris rang the officer back at 2:05 in the morning on his work phone. Within seconds of that police call connecting, within seconds of an officer beginning to speak with the man at the center of an active missing persons investigation, Nickel Kessinger called Chris's personal phone. Both lines were live simultaneously. The officer on the work phone, Kessinger on the personal phone. At 2 in the morning, while Shanann and her daughters were still listed as missing persons. Investigators who reviewed that sequence noted what the timing suggests. She was on that line, tracking what the officer was asking and monitoring how Chris was responding in real time. She has never been formally asked to explain why she called back at that exact moment. That 2:05 call was the last documented contact between Nickel Kessinger and Chris Watts, made shortly before she cleared what remained on her phone and surrendered the device to investigators. Now let us talk about the forensic report. Because this is, in documented terms, the most overlooked piece of official paperwork in this entire case. In October 2018, Detective Michael Prill submitted his forensic report to the Weld County District Attorney's Office. What he put in that document is striking in both its detail and its implications. He documented that Chris Watts had a hidden application on his phone, one designed to appear as a standard calculator, through which photographs were being sent and received entirely outside any normal message thread. Tracing those images would have required a separate investigative process. That process never happened. He documented Kessinger's use of Skype, a platform with its own independent message infrastructure requiring a separate legal subpoena to access. Those records were never requested. He documented Chris's confirmed use of Snapchat, a platform specifically designed to remove messages automatically after they are viewed. Those records were never subpoenaed. And then Prill documented what he called the hard limit, the technology available to the Northern Colorado Forensic Laboratory in 2018 was not capable of fully extracting data from Apple devices. He stated this plainly in writing in an official government document. He estimated that hundreds of messages, and potentially far more, were permanently beyond the reach of what that laboratory could recover at the time. The investigation was declared complete with that limit still in place, and that data still unreachable. But here is the word that stops researchers cold every single time they read that report. Prill used one specific word in that official government document to describe Kessinger's voicemails and her conduct across the material he reviewed. Creepy. That is a forensic detective's word, placed into an official report submitted to the district attorney, about a woman the prosecution had classified as a cooperative and credible witness. That report was submitted on October 30th, 2018. 7 days later, on November 6th, Chris Watts pleaded guilty. No trial, no cross-examination, no moment where Nickel Kessinger was placed under oath in front of a defense attorney who had read every word of what Prill documented. 7 days separated that forensic report from a guilty plea that closed every courtroom door permanently. Under standard legal procedure, discovery materials move from the district attorney's office through the court to defense counsel and then to the defendant. In a case of this profile, that process typically takes a matter of days. By approximately November 2nd or 3rd, Chris Watts, sitting in Weld County Jail, very likely had access to every page of what Prill had documented. And on November 6th, he pleaded guilty. The death penalty had been a possibility in this case. It was removed not at the initiative of Watts or his legal team. It was removed because Shanann's family asked for it. They did not want another life taken. The district attorney sought their approval before agreeing to that condition. That decision was theirs, and it was the right one to make. But the consequence was permanent. No trial, no witness stand, no moment where the documented contradictions, the phone searches, the cell tower data, the hidden application, the unsubpoenaed platforms, and the word Prill chose to put beside her name in an official document ever reached a courtroom. And here is what D.A. Rourke said publicly about Kessinger's role in the prosecution. He described her information as a bombshell that helped build the case against Watts. He said Chris appeared to have had every intention of starting a new life with her. He said that in open court, on the official record. That is not the language a prosecutor uses about someone he believed had no awareness of what was forming around them. He did not say she was innocent. He said the evidence at that moment did not support charges. Those are not the same statement. And the space between them is where every unanswered question in this case continues to live. On November 19, 2018, 2 weeks after the guilty plea, Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced Chris Watts at the Weld County District Court. The judge had spent 17 years on that bench across thousands of criminal cases. When he spoke that morning, he said directly that this was the most inhumane and devastating crime he had encountered in his entire career. 5 life terms without the possibility of parole. An additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy. 36 years for charges related to the treatment of the remains. Chris Watts will die inside that facility. But on that same day, at that same sentencing, Rourke addressed Kessinger's role on the record. He called her information a bombshell. He said Chris had every intention of building a new life with her. 1 week between Prill's report and the guilty plea. 2 weeks to the sentencing. Every door that led toward a courtroom closed inside that 30-day window. And everything the discovery file had been building toward stayed exactly where it was. Confirmed, documented, and unresolved. So where does this case stand today? Nickel Kessinger gave one interview, a single conversation with the Denver Post in late 2018. She described herself as deceived and misled. She said Chris lied about everything, and then she went silent. In October 2020, the same month the Netflix documentary American Murder reached tens of millions of new viewers, she filed to legally change her name in Jefferson County, Colorado. The documentary arrived. The name change followed. Both happened inside the same 30-day window. In January 2025, she appeared briefly in video footage from a funeral service in Billings, Montana. Online researchers identified her from a few seconds of footage that had not been aimed at her. That appearance was not intentional. In February 2026, a published report examined her current whereabouts. A privacy expert speaking to that report noted that successfully maintaining this level of anonymity for this long is not a small task, that it requires a degree of effort and specific knowledge most people simply do not have. The report indicated she may currently be living under the name Nicole Miller, 8 years outside any formal investigative process. Here is what needs to be stated with precision before we close. D.A. Michael Rourke made a legal determination in 2018 that the evidence at that specific moment did not meet the threshold required to move forward with charges. That was a prosecutorial decision made at a point in time, before the January search data was independently examined, before Skype records were ever requested, before Snapchat was subpoenaed, and before Prill's documented forensic limit was treated as a starting point rather than a stopping point. It was not an acquittal. Courts issue acquittals. This was not a court finding. It was not a declaration of innocence. Rourke did not say she was innocent. He said the evidence at that moment did not support charges. Those are different statements, and the difference between them is not a small one. And now something else has changed. The limit Prill documented in 2018 is no longer the limit. Modern forensic tools operate significantly beyond what existed when that report was written. Data he confirmed as beyond reach under 2018 conditions may not be beyond reach today. The Skype records were never requested. That means those records may still exist, held by the platform, waiting for a legal request that never came. The hidden calculator application, through which photographs were being sent outside any normal message thread, was documented by Prill, but the images inside it were never fully traced. The Snapchat account was never subpoenaed, and Snapchat has since been subject to successful legal processes in other high-profile cases. Metadata, timestamps, account activity, some of it recoverable, some of it preserved by the platform longer than users typically assume. None of those avenues were pursued when this case closed. Closing a prosecution around a guilty plea is not the same as answering every question the evidence raised. So here is where the official record currently stands. A 5-month gap between a name search and a stated relationship start date, confirmed by the district attorney. Never independently investigated. A cell tower ping placing her device near the Watts family home on the morning of August 13th. Documented. Never formally explained. A text message asking for photographic proof of a location on the only day that location became the center of a murder investigation, with no precedent anywhere in months of prior communication. Documented. Never questioned. 3 communication platforms that were never subpoenaed. Hundreds of messages acknowledged as unrecoverable under 2018 conditions. A forensic report that used the word creepy to describe the conduct of the prosecution's own cooperative witness, submitted to the district attorney and never pursued. And a published book, available right now, in which the man convicted of these murders told the person in the cell next to him that he had an accomplice. That is not where this story ends, but that is where the official record currently stands. And I want to ask you something directly. Not for a theory, not for speculation. Leave one question in the comments. The single thing from everything covered across these 2 parts that you believe deserves a formal, official answer and has never received one. Because unlike the people who had this evidence confirmed in front of them and moved on, we are not moving on. The victims in this case deserved better than an incomplete investigation declared finished. Shanann deserved better. Bella deserved better. Celeste deserved better. Nico deserved better. And the questions sitting in the official record, placed there by law enforcement itself, deserve to be spoken out loud clearly, and without looking away. If you have stayed with us through both parts of this investigation, you already understand why this case matters beyond the conviction. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence right now if you are not already here, because the next chapter of this series goes inside all 6 of Kessinger's recorded interviews and walks through the specific moments that researchers who have spent years with this file identify as the clearest missed opportunities in the entire investigation. What was asked, what was not, and why the distance between those 2 things is more significant than anything else this case produced. Like this video if the documented record gave you something worth thinking about. It helps more people find this investigation, and this investigation is worth finding. We will see you there.